Oh, good morning, protege, or of course, good afternoon to my wonderful and favorite afternoon class. Hey, I hope this direct instructional Zoomcast finds you well. So this is going to be my direct instruction for Monday, and this is December 6th, 2021. Let's get into it, shall we? You guys know the drill at this point. All right, so at this time, I'm going to be sharing my screen with you. You should already have your notes dated in the top right-hand corner. Remember, every time we take notes and watch a Zoomcast, it's a new day, it's a new date, therefore it's a new page. So don't go back to the previous page. We're going to start fresh. So again, on the top line, every single page in your ISN should have either a topic heading for direct instructional lectures / Zoomcast notes or for an assignment. So here's our topic. Write this down. We're calling it the Battle of the Marne. So this is going to be your first major significant battle in World War I along the Western Front. So again, we're going to be focusing primarily on the Western Front as we study and examine, again, the Great War, World War I. There was also the Eastern Front, which I'm going to briefly reference today. And in addition, there was also an Italian front, the fighting between Italy and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right on the border between Italy and Austria-Hungary, and also the Middle Eastern front, fighting in, again, what was part of, again, the Ottoman Empire, today countries such as Syria, Lebanon, and present-day Israel. All right, let's get into it. Here we go. So the month of September, and the year is 1914. So the Germans at this point are executing and carrying out what's called the Schlieffen Plan. Now I'm going to come back to the Schlieffen Plan in just a moment, because again, you have to understand the Schlieffen Plan in order to understand the First Battle of the Marne. And by the way, I call it the First Battle of the Marne because there's actually two battles of the Marne. The first one was fought in September of 1914, and the second one will be fought 4 years later. And in 4 years, the style of fighting of World War I will have changed again. So several key points. So number one, so as I just stated, this is the first Battle of the Marne. There was a second one, a sequel, a follow-up 4 years later in 1918. So again, I want to emphasize there's going to be times during the Zoomcast I am going to go a little faster, but that's the beauty of the Zoomcast, is that you can pause it anytime you want. And I want to emphasize to everybody, you guys have gotten much better in terms of, again, your main notes are great, but you have to be adding more notes. You have to add those oral notes into the side to clarify the main notes, because you're going to be noticing more and more assessment questions are going to be based not just on the bullet notes, the main points, but also the oral notes that you're adding in for further clarification and understanding. So this is going to be a 6-day battle. It was started on September 6th of 1914 and it will end the 12th on 1914. So again, this is going to be considered to be the first major battle along the Western Front. So there was a battle fought earlier, several weeks earlier, that was fought along what we call the Eastern Front. And in the video clip that I'm going to be sharing with you guys today as part of the Zoomcast, that's going to be including it. So keep that in mind. All right, let's continue on. So you now know, so who are the major players? So we have to start with our German commander. So the German commander is a gentleman by the name of Helmuth von Moltke. You pronounce his name, von Moltke. That's the way you pronounce it. And we want to always associate a name with a face and a face with a name. That's a photograph right here of Helmuth von Moltke. Take a good look at that photograph. There's a good chance you're going to be seeing his face, this photograph, on your assessment on World War I. And then your French commander, this is the guy that's going to be assigned to defend France as the Germans have invaded France as a result of the Schlieffen Plan. His name is Joseph Joffre. And if you direct your attention up to the overhead screen, that of course is Joseph Joffre. And again, take a good look at both of these photographs. There's a very real chance you're going to be seeing them on your next assessment on World War I. All right. So once again, a couple of things. This represents what we call the Western Front. So it starts way up here in Belgium. And then if you follow my cursor, it cuts through a huge swatch of France. And it eventually ends up way down over here. You can't really see it, but right there, you see that? It ends up in Switzerland, which was, again, a neutral country. But the vast majority of the Western Front runs primarily through France. You're going to need to know that for your assessment. Now, before we go any further, let's go back for just a moment. This is the Schlieffen Plan, okay? Remember, the Schlieffen Plan was, again, completed way back in 1905. So this is almost 10 years before the start of World War I. So in my mind, when the Germans came up with the Schlieffen Plan, they were already anticipating a major war was going to break out between themselves and their neighbors to the west, or arch nemesis, the French. So remember, as part of the Schlieffen Plan, the German army is going to split into two wings. You've got your left wing, which is right over here, and the right wing up here. The left wing is the ruse. It's the decoy to draw the French to the border. But at the same time, the main part of the German army, the right wing, which is way up over here, would cut through neutral countries, Belgium and the Netherlands, primarily Belgium, enter into France, circle around, and right there is the capital of France. That's Paris. You might want to make a little oral side note. That's the key to victory to the Germans. If they can capture Paris before these French troops realize what happened, they thought they could have the war won before the holiday season. All right, now if you guys would go back and please write this down. So I just wanted to clarify that again. So in early September of 1914, the German army was on the march. The right wing, I want to emphasize that. So the right wing, again, had cut through Belgium way back in August and was now in France and was heading on its way to Paris, the capital. It's less than 20 miles away. So the big question is, what happened to the French? Where is the French army? Why aren't they defending its capital? Because once you lose your capital, for all intents and purposes, you have lost the war. So here's your answer. You're not going to see this in TCI. I'm really going to go into a lot more depth in TCI. They're just giving you a general overview. It's our job as a history teacher to tell you the full story. So the French were implementing what's called French Plan, and this is Roman numerals. I know they don't teach it in school anymore, which is a shame. So an X represents a 10, the V represents a 5, and each of these Roman numerals represents a 1. So 10 and 5 is 15, 16, 17. So draw a line off to the side. This is French Plan 17. So French Plan 17 was actually created before the Schlieffen Plan was created back in 1905. So French Plan 17's roots actually goes back to the end of the Franco-Prussian War, which I taught you guys about earlier. That was that war between the Prussians, which will become, again, Germany, shortly when all those German states all unite and join together to form this modern country. And the Prussian army had just completely overwhelmed the French and caught the French completely off guard. And the French realized, as a result of the Franco-Prussian War and the Treaty of Frankfurt of 1871, where they were forced to give up Alsace-Lorraine, they realized that if they were going to beat the Germans on the battlefield, they would have to make some changes. So number one of the things that the French did, they borrowed from the Prussians / the Germans, is they're going to be building up their railroads to transport troops, because that's what the Prussian army did in 1870. They were able to mobilize their troops much more quickly than the French ever anticipated. And the Germans / the Prussians had learned that from observing the Union Army during the Civil War, making that connection. You should add a little side note about that. You're tying together all the loose ends in terms of telling the story. Now, here's the other thing the French are going to do with French Plan 17. So they're going to be building up and building more railroads to be able to mobilize and transport troops. But what they're also going to do is they're going to build up their forces right along the French-German border, because what they were anticipating was a full-scale invasion of this dispute, or these two disputed territories that the Germans and the French have been fighting over for over 800 years, and that's Alsace-Lorraine. Remember, sometimes the Germans control it, sometimes the French control it. Well, as a result of the Treaty of Frankfurt of 1871, which ended the Franco-Prussian War, now the Germans control Alsace-Lorraine and the French want it back. So the French were already mobilizing at this point, preparing for a full-scale invasion to take back Alsace-Lorraine from the Germans. So it's kind of ironic. This is the same map that I used for the Schlieffen Plan. It could be also used for French Plan 17, because these blue lines here represent the French forces, And what they were doing was they were mobilizing right over here on the border, hoping to reclaim Alsace-Lorraine, except the Germans beat them to the punch. All right, so please write this down. So again, the French had mobilized along the border. They saw, the left wing of the German army. They fell for the ruse. It was a decoy. The main part of the German army, the right wing, had cut through Belgium, was now in France, and was literally 20 miles away from Paris itself. So now the French realized they've got to figure out a way to get all these troops from the border all the way back to Paris. That's quite a distance. So who saves the day? Yes, draw a line off to the side. Taxi cabs. Yes. So literally what the French did was they were able to send all these taxi cabs from Paris over to the border, and they start bringing the troops back in addition to the railroads. So now they're able to mobilize and move their troops back from the border back to Paris. And at this point, now the French are better prepared to be able to save Paris from the German army. All right, so here's what I need from you guys. We're going to come back to those notes in a moment. I want you to skip a full page. I want you to go to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. Date your notes again for today. It's December 6, 2021. And I want you to write down for me video clip, Battle of the Marne and the failure of the Schlieffen Plan. So once again, I'm going to be sharing a very powerful video clip. I love these video clips because they do a great job of tying together all the loose ends. And of course, as I keep saying again and again and again, telling the story. And by the way, as you're going to find out, the Battle of the Marne very easily could have ended World War I in a couple of months. Instead, this battle is going to determine that this war is going to last 4 long, bloody years. And the longer this war drags on, the higher the casualties go up. All right, so let me share some guide questions. I am going to go through these quickly. And again, you guys do a great job. Pause the Zoomcast, give yourself a chance to catch up. Yes, this video is fair game for your next assessment. Here we go, number 1. So in order to understand the Battle of the Marne and the failure of the Schlieffen Plan, you got to go back to when the Germans first invaded Belgium back in August of 1914. That's an important part of the story. So I want you to compare the German army with the Belgian army. Compare means, do you see any similarities? Contrast means, do you see any differences? So maybe we should put compare/contrast here, because you are looking for similarities, but as you're going to discover, there's a lot more differences between the Belgian army and the German army. Number 2, what was the Belgian army's only hope in stopping the Germans? The Germans had their army was a juggernaut. It was almost impossible to stop. Everybody in Europe for centuries knew that the Germans historically and traditionally have always had the biggest, strongest army in all of Europe. How can a small country like Belgium be able to stop the Germans? Number 3, what was the German secret weapon that they're going to unleash on the Belgians? And by the way, this secret weapon is going to play a huge role as we get further and further into the Great War, World War I, as you'll find out. Next question. So remember, the Schlieffen Plan was the idea of knocking the French out of the war as quickly as possible, and then focusing your attention on the Eastern fronts. So the next guide question is, how is the Schlieffen Plan faring along the Eastern fronts? That would be the fighting between the Germans on one side and the Russians on the other side. I want you to be able to describe for me the Russian army along the Eastern Front in 1914. So I'm going to shift gears temporarily away from the Western Front, the fighting between the French and the Germans, and we're going to focus instead a couple of weeks earlier on the fighting between the Germans and the Russians. Remember, the Russians and the French and the Brits were all allies. They're part of what we call the Allied powers. Next guide question. What happened at Tannenberg in 1914? And by the way, you can make a little side note. This is your first major battle of World War I. It wasn't fought in the Western Front. It was fought in the Eastern Front. So what the video is going to do, it's going to talk about and share with you what happened at this important battle, because it kind of foreshadows Mr. Podolsky, Mr. Fisk, Mrs. Weinstein term, LA. I love foreshadowing. This is going to foreshadow the way this war is going to play out. Stats? Any stats you hear, jot it down. No, I'm not going to ask you a specific question. How many casualties were there at Tannenberg, or how many casualties were there at the Battle of the Marne? However, stats are important because it, again, provides clarity and understanding. It could be a context clue. It could be used in an answer choice. So that's why I always say to students again and again and again, if you hear statistics, channel your inner Mr. Rosenack and write it down. Finally, what was the outcome of the Battle of the Marne? So then the video is going to shift gears back to the Western Front, focusing on the fighting between Helmuth von Moltke, the German commander who was, again, basically handpicked by von Schlieffen to be able to carry out and execute the Schlieffen Plan, and Joseph Joffre representing, or Joffre, representing the French forces sent in to defend Paris at all costs. All right, ladies and gentlemen, if you would please direct your attention up to the overhead screen. So this is, again, the video for the Schlieffen Plan's failure and the Battle of the Marne. So this video is almost 4 minutes long. Here we go, and take really good notes. Enjoy, everybody. Here we go.
On the morning of August the 4th, 1914, the German cavalry crossed the border into neutral Belgium. The Belgians decided to fight back. They had few weapons and only 150,000 men. The German army outnumbered them 10 to 1. Belgium's only hope was the forts around the city of Liège. These underground fortresses had over 400 guns and were thought to be one of the strongest military positions in Europe. But the Germans had planned for the forts and brought out a secret weapon. Big Bertha, the world's largest cannon. The enormous shells smashed through the forts. The Belgians held out as long as possible, but one by one, the forts were captured. But the bravery of the Belgians had slowed up the German advance. So did the British, who, to Germany's surprise, stuck to their agreement with Belgium. Britain immediately sent most of its small professional army to France, where they were soon in action. In the east, the Schlieffen Plan was already failing. The Russian army had mobilized quickly and crossed the border. Thousands of Germans were forced to leave their homes. The Kaiser sent more troops and 2 of his most experienced generals to face the Russians. The Russians outnumbered the Germans 4 to 1, but they had poor leaders and little training and equipment. Some soldiers didn't even have a rifle. The generals in charge of the Russian army had divided their forces and entered Germany from different directions. The Germans decided to combine their forces and headed south to Tannenberg. Within a month, the Germans had pushed the Russians back, killing 250,000 men. The Russian advance into Germany had been stopped. In France, things weren't going so well for the Germans. The German attack was slowing down as they ran out of supplies. Instead of surrounding Paris, as originally planned, they moved east towards the Marne. The French army could now attack, and every available French soldier was rushed to the front. The soldiers were going to the Battle of the Marne. It lasted 6 days and involved 2 million men. When the battle ended, the German advance had been stopped. Paris was saved, and the Schlieffen Plan was in ruins. The war was going to take longer than the Germans had planned.
Great video. So some takeaways I wanted to share with you guys. Number one, they alluded to the two German commanders at the Battle of Tannenberg or Battle of Tannenberg Forest. On the left was Paul von Hindenburg, the future president of Germany, who will make the decision to appoint chancellor, a guy by the name of Adolf Hitler. Another story, another time. The guy on the right, to von Hindenburg's left, was Erich Ludendorff. Ludendorff and von Hindenburg were considered to be Germany's two finest generals. And what they're going to eventually do is they're going to shift them eventually from the Eastern Front to fighting in the Western Front. And by the way, Erich Ludendorff, after World War I had ended up joining this brand new political party that we know as Nazis. And one of the guys he encountered was a guy by the name of Adolf Hitler. So we'll be weaving those two German generals into our story even after we finish World War I. My other takeaway is number two, when they mentioned Tannenberg, about the casualties in that one battle, over 250,000 casualties the Russians had suffered. And again, a casualty, remember, it could be one of four things: killed in action, KIA, missing in action, MIA, prisoner of war, POW, or injured. And often in those days, if you were wounded or injured, chances are you weren't going to recover from your injuries. And the other thing is, when you look at what happened at Tannenberg and what happened at the Battle of the Marne, what it basically guaranteed was that everybody was completely wrong. Everybody thought this war would be over in a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months. They talked about they'd all be home in time to harvest, do their final harvest before the winter seasons came in, and everybody was wrong. The Central Powers were wrong. The Allied powers were wrong. So instead of ending in a couple of weeks or a couple of months, this is going to be 4 long, incredibly bloody years. All right, continuing on. Here's what I need you to do. Go back to those previous notes. We're going to write this down. So the Battle of the Marne was important, and I'm going to summarize it for you guys and give you 4 reasons. I love that video. I think the video does a great job of not only encapsulating the Battle of the Marne, but also weaving in the Battle of Tannenberg, your first major battle of World War I that was fought in the Eastern Front. All right, number 1. As they mentioned in the video, it was 6 long, bloody days of fierce fighting. The Germans, again, that right wing had slowed down and was outside of Paris itself by the Marne River. And it gave the French the chance to bring all their troops back from the front, some through trains, some through taxi cabs. And so the Germans will make the decision to withdraw from the battle. So because the Germans withdrew from the battle, and I would draw a line off to the side, that means they did not achieve their goal. So therefore, you would call this a loss. And for the French, you would call it a victory, but not a complete victory, as we're going to find out. So a couple of things. Number 1, this is the first major victory of the Allies. Remember, just a couple weeks earlier at Tannenberg, the Russian army had been basically annihilated by the Germans, who had combined their forces. This is, again, a real eye-opener. Number 2, this Battle of the Marne, the fact that the French were able to successfully mobilize and bring all those troops back, again, from the border between Germany and France, all the way back to Paris to defend the city and save Paris, it was a tremendous morale boost. Morale means confidence. I would draw a line and add a little side note. And remember, too, not only did the French, or were the French able to save Paris, but also they beat the Germans. The Germans have this reputation, when you study the history of Germany through the centuries, that their army is basically is infallible. It's undefeatable. And the fact that they were able to get the Germans to withdraw was a huge morale boost, a confidence boost. But there's a catch. And I want you to go back over where I wrote withdraw. Draw a line off to the side. So even though the Germans withdrew from the battle, they didn't withdraw from France. They're there. And they're going to stay in France for the next 4 years. They're going to militarily occupy their sworn enemy to the west, much to the chagrin of the French. So even though it's a victory, it's not a total victory, because if it had been a total victory for the French, they would have driven the Germans all the way back to Germany across the Rhine River. That didn't happen. And that will not happen for another 4 long, bloody years. Number 2, second reason why, again, the first Battle of the Marne was important is because as a result of this battle, the Germans make the fateful decision to abandon the Schlieffen Plan. And again, they were hoping to score that quick victory Remember, they wanted to knock the French out of the war and then focus their undivided attention on the Russians. Now, the catch was the Russians had been notoriously slow to mobilize compared to the French. The Russians caught the Germans off guard on how quickly they mobilized when they invaded Germany, as you saw in the video clip, and the fact that the Germans were anticipating a quick victory over the French. They figured once they captured Paris that basically they would force the French out and then give their undivided attention to fighting the Russians, and that's not the way it played out. So because this plan kind of fell apart on both the Eastern and Western fronts, the Schlieffen Plan will be abandoned. And as we are going to find out, this is going to be a mistake for the Germans. And I think one of the biggest reasons why the Germans made the decision to abandon the Schlieffen Plan is because, remember, two of the keys of the Schlieffen Plan were using the elements of speed and surprise. Well, the element of surprise is gone because now the Germans are in France and the French know it because they're there. And number two, again, they were hoping to use the element of speed to be able to catch the French completely off guard. But again, by allowing the French to bring their troops and mobilize their troops back from the front all the way back to save Paris from the German army, this was, again, in the Germans' mind, it defeated the purpose. This was supposed to be a quick victory. They thought they would have this whole thing wrapped up probably by the holiday season. That's not the way this plays out. And if you direct your attention to the overhead screen, I want you to take a good look at this photograph because later on you're going to write a brief reflection on it. These are French troops that are, again, mobilized. This is basically a makeshift wall of berm. And this is the way the fighting at the beginning of World War I was fought at the Battle of the Marne. But as we're going to quickly find out, this style of fighting, which is more similar to what you would have seen in the Civil War or the Franco-Prussian War, it's going to change dramatically, as you're going to find out. Number three, third reason why the Battle of the Marne was important, because it now guarantees that the Germans are wrong. Remember, the Germans thought with the Schlieffen Plan they could score the quick victory. They thought they could have this war won in basically 3 months. It's not gonna end in 3 months. It's gonna end in 4 years, and it's gonna end up in a German defeat. But the Germans had their chances, as we're gonna find out, to win World War I very easily. The history of the Great War could have been a very different story. So because the Germans made the decision to withdraw from the battle, but remember what I said earlier, kids, they're not withdrawing from France itself. They're going to be there for 4 more years. So here's one of the most important words you need to know. The word is stalemate. That is a word that's going to dominate World War I from 1914 until literally the summer of 1918, and that's 4 years into the future. So what does stalemate mean? So once again, notice my cursor, draw a line off to the side. You need to be adding this as a side oral note. For those of you who are not doing it, you got to do a better job, because if you're not, this could potentially be a test question. I'm going to be starting to assess more on oral notes as well as your main bullet notes as too. So stalemate simply means when neither side is strong enough to defeat the other. That's a stalemate. That means that the Germans and the Central Powers are not strong enough to defeat the Allied powers, the French, the Brits, and the Russians. And conversely, the Allied powers, the French, the Brits, and Russians, are not strong enough to be able to defeat the Central Powers, the Germans, and of course, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So what's the result? This is a great example of cause, and this is the effect. So as a result of the fact that neither side is really militarily strong enough to soundly and thoroughly defeat the other. Yes, the French can claim victory at the Battle of Marne, that's fine. But you didn't drive the Germans out of your homeland. They're there. They're going to occupy your country for the next 4 years along the Western Front. So as a result, you are now going to witness a new style of fighting that's going to be introduced after the Battle of the Marne, and it's going to become much more prevalent in 1915, 1916, 1917, and it won't be really until autumn of 1918, several years later, that this style of fighting will eventually start to cease and will morph into something different. So what is this style of fighting? So here's what I want you to do. I want you to take a good look at this photograph. These are French soldiers, and this is the Battle of the Marne. Again, this is more of a typical style of fighting you would have seen during the Civil War, 1861 through 1865, Union versus Confederacy, or the Franco-Prussian War, 1870/71. Now, look what happens within the next 6 months. So the soldiers are going to go from fighting this way to this way. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to stop the Zoomcast. I want you to take 3 minutes and you're going to draw a line off this side. We're going to write a reflection. And in this reflection, I want you to compare and contrast this photograph that was taken at the time of the Battle of the Marne and this photograph that was taken basically in 1916. And this is called the Battle of the Somme, which you're going to be learning about. And I want you, again, in about 3 to 5 minutes, to compare and contrast these two photographs. This is the style of fighting in 1914. This is the style of fighting in 1916. Any similarities? Or you're going to probably see a lot more differences. So I, of course, am going to continue on. All right, finally, number 4. So the last reason why the Battle of the Marne was important is because Helmut von Moltke, the German commander, handpicked by von Schlieffen to basically allow the Germans to score the quick victory. Remember, the Schlieffen Plan was created 9 years before the start of the war, meaning the Germans already were anticipating it's not a matter of if they go to war with their arch nemesis, the French. It was a matter of when they were going to go to war with the French. But von Moltke made a couple of mistakes. And these mistakes will ultimately cost the Germans a chance to score that quick victory. And as a result, this war is going to drag on for, again, several more years. And the longer the war drags on, the higher the casualties are going to go up. So number 1. So von Moltke made a couple of mistakes. Mistake number 1, he cut down the number of troops that were sent to what we call the right wing. The left wing was the decoy. The right wing was the invasionary force that cut through Belgium into France. He cut it down. As a matter of fact, there was a story that when von Schlieffen had died, I think it was in 1913, I think he died a year before the Great War started, that von Schlieffen's alleged dying last words were, quote, "keep the right wing strong." And for whatever reasons, General von Moltke did not keep the right wing strong. He shifted more of the troops to the left wing, maybe to act as a decoy to try to dupe the French into thinking that's where the invasion was coming. Regardless of his motivation, it turned out that von Schlieffen was right. If von Moltke had shifted more of his troops to the right wing, they probably would have scored the quick victory in capturing Paris and knocking the French out of the war. Then they could have focused their attention on the Russians on the Eastern Front, and the war could have literally been over probably before the holiday season started. And then finally, number 2, here's the key, this mistake that von Moltke made. So von Moltke, number 1, puts not enough troops here in the right wing. The invasion of Belgium and France puts too many troops over here. And number 2, von Moltke had a clear shot at Paris. And if you remember in the video, he went east of Paris along the Marne River. And von Moltke's biggest mistake was he waited. He hesitated. And he gave the French time to bring their troops back. By the way, when we get to World War II in January of next year, 2022, the Germans, the Nazis, are going to update the Schlieffen Plan. I always call it Schlieffen Plan 2.0. Basically did the same thing in 1940, except this time, the leader of Germany, a guy named Schicklgruber, we know him as Adolf Hitler, basically told his German commanders, you will not make the same mistake that von Moltke did at Paris. When we invade France, you will score the quick victory. And as we are going to find out, Hitler was successful in doing it, sadly for the French, because they will once again occupy France for 4 years. But that's another story for another time. All right, here's what I want you to do. I want you to skip a full page, and I want you guys to go to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. And what I want you to do is I'd like you to date your notes for today. And of course, it is December 6, 2022. And I want you to write this down for me. It's called The Horror of War. So here's what I'm going to do. I would like to introduce this to you. I'm not going to finish this for you guys today because we're coming close to that time. But I want to give you guys a little bit of background information. And it ties in with the end of the Battle of the Marne. Remember how, again, both sides are experiencing what we call stalemate. Neither side is strong enough to beat the other, So now both sides are required to dig in literally and figuratively. And instead of fighting an offensive war, which is what the Germans were hoping, what the French were hoping with French Plan 17, and the Germans with the Schlieffen Plan, now they're going to be fighting not an offensive war, but both sides are going to be fighting a defensive war. Okay? So please write this down. So in 1916, so we are now 2 years now removed from the Battle of the Marne back in September of 1914, September 6th through the 12th. So by 1916, World War I can be best described as a stalemate. Stalemate, once again, I'm going to repeat myself a third time. A stalemate means that neither side is strong enough to defeat the other side. So in 1916, and I generally don't do a lot of the big battles of World War I. I do more in World War II. But I think if you want to understand the essence of the horror of war, all wars are horrible. I don't care if you're talking about the Civil War. I don't care if you're talking about the Mexican War of 1846. I don't care if you're talking about the War of 1812 or the American Revolution that you guys studied last year. But there's something incredibly insidious about World War I. And it ties in with this new style of fighting. And this new style of fighting, as you're going to find out in my next Zoomcast, is called trench warfare. So there are two battles to me that encapsulate the horror of war, especially World War I, when you talk about this new style of fighting, and it's called trench warfare. So the first major battle is called the Battle of Verdun. So the Battle of Verdun started in February of 1916. And I want you to notice that the fighting continued all the way until July of 1916. So if you do the math, that's, again, March, April, May, June, July. So I would draw a line off this, like, pardon me, it's a 5-month battle. Not 6 days, 5 months. So think about that. Gettysburg, which you learned about last year, the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, July, was a 3-day battle. And there were over 50,000 casualties. So how many casualties do you think there's going to be at Verdun now that they have far more sophisticated and deadlier weapons? And you're looking at a battle that doesn't last 3 days, but rather closer to 6 months. And number two, the other big battle that is really significant is called the Battle of the Somme. So the Battle of the Somme starts basically around the same time as Verdun was wrapping up. And this battle starts in July of 1916. And it ends in November of 1916. So if you do the math, August, September, October, November. So this is going to be about a 4-month battle. I would draw a line off to the side. And if you direct your attention to the overhead screen, this is an iconic photograph that was taken, and this is the Battle of Verdun. These are German soldiers. I know they're German soldiers because I can tell by their helmets. This is what we call a trench right here. This is trench warfare. And what these soldiers have been given are the orders to go over the top. Over the top means you climb out of your trench. And you notice now they're beginning what's called running across this area right here. You see what I'm circling with my cursor? That's called no man's land. So no man's land is the area between the trenches. So here you got your German trenches here. And way on the opposite side, you have the Allied trenches. In this case, it would be the French trenches. And this area right here is no man's land. It was called no man's land because no person wanted to be there. So I'm going to introduce the Battle of Verdun, if you would write this down. So I just want to share with you some key points about the Battle of Verdun first. And we'll save the Somme for another time. All right, so number one, as I stated earlier, 5-month battle. I go back again to the Civil War. Battle of Antietam. Battle of Antietam was a 1-day battle. In 1 day, over 20,000 casualties suffered by the Union Army. That was 1 day. It was technically in Antietam was 3 different battles fought simultaneously. But this is a battle that was basically fought and lasted over 5 months. And again, I would make a little side oral note. The weapons that both sides are going to use at Verdun are far deadlier than the weapons that the Union and the Confederacy had in 1862. So again, moving on, number two. So the German commander, there's a brand new one. Helmut von Moltke has been removed. And the new German commander, along what we call the Western Front, is a guy by the name of Erich von Falkenhayn. Yes, you're going to need to know his name for your next assessment. And so remember how the Germans had abandoned the Schlieffen Plan? And so now as a result, they're trying to figure out the best way. Now, this war has been dragging on for 2 years now, kids. And so as a result, the Germans, like the Allies, are looking for a way of breaking the stalemates. So von Falkenhayn is going to create a new plan for victory. And if you direct your attention to the overhead screen, we want to always associate a name with a face and a face with a name. I want you to take a good look at this photograph. You're going to be seeing his photograph somewhere on your next assessment. That's why I want you guys to really look at these photographs, because these are great context clues to help you when you're diagnosing a question on an assessment. So ladies and gentlemen, let's continue on. So here's what he's going to do. So the new German plan for victory is a very dark one. It's a very insidious one. And it's called waging a war of attrition. And this is the key word that you want to circle, and you want to, again, be able to put lots and lots and lots of asterisks around. So if you direct your attention up to the overhead screen, I'm not going to tell you what a war of attrition is yet, because you're going to learn about it in the video clip. This is a horrific photograph that was taken during World War I. This is a photograph that was taken at the Battle of Verdun. This is basically, this photograph pretty much foreshadows, pretty much summarizes this very chilling new German master plan for defeating the French and knocking them out of the war. And this photograph is a clue for what is a war of attrition. So what exactly happens at the Battle of Verdun, one of your seminal, quintessential trench warfare battles of the Great War? You will find out next time. So ladies and gentlemen, at this point, what I would like everybody to do is I now want you to take your correctable tape out. And right now, I'd like everybody to please go and clean up anything you crossed out or traced over in your ISN. This is the time to be doing it, not during when you're watching the Zoomcast, because you're losing your train of thought. You're being distracted, okay? Now I want you to take out your multiple colored highlighters. I expect a minimum of 2. And I want you to really focus on those words you can visualize in your mind, the persons, places, and the things. As I circulate around the room, it's really obvious the students who are taking really good notes, who are doing a great job with their highlighting, you are the students who are doing extremely well on these assessments. So I'm going to give you a nice golf clap. Well done. And if you're not doing these things to be successful, maybe that's why your assessment scores are not where they should be. So the challenge is now you need to step up. I want to see everybody make certain that you're taking those really good copious notes, not just the main notes, but the oral notes, and then going back and highlighting. Because remember, what highlighting does, it's a form of studying. It's reinforcing this information. It's allowing you to develop mastery. If you're not highlighting, you're not studying. And that's one of the reasons why your assessment scores are not what they should be. Please remember, you're not done yet. Now you're going to take the 10 to 15 minutes and you're going to go back and review everything we covered today. As we learned about the Battle of the Marne, you learned about French Plan 17, which was created, again, a little bit before the Schlieffen Plan. You learned about how the Battle of the Marne is going to play out and how this battle ends up, even though it's a French victory, but it's a costly one because it wasn't a decisive one, because the Germans don't leave. They're going to stay in France along what's called the Western Front for 4 years. And then talk about the outcome of the Battle of the Marne. Talk about, again, the horror of trench warfare and Verdun. I just gave you bits and pieces about trench warfare. We're going to go into a lot more detail. Please remember, if you have an opportunity, hand your ISN to somebody, your mom, your dad, a brother, sister. You teach this information. It's the most natural, organic way to study. It allows your brain to sort this information, create images in your mind, and it allows you to develop mastery in telling the story, because that's what this class is all about. So for my next Zoomcast, which will probably be for tomorrow, and that will be Tuesday, December 7th, the day that will live in infamy. That is the anniversary, of course, the attack on Pearl Harbor, which ushered in the United States entrance into World War II, the sequel to World War I. I'm going to come back to Verdun, but before I do that, I'm going to give you a nice overview of the horror of trench warfare. And then once you get a better understanding of what trench warfare was all about, then I'm going to dovetail back to the Battle of Verdun, and I'm going to talk about the Battle of the Somme, those quintessential, seminal World War I trench warfare battles. So again, I hope you enjoyed today's Zoomcast from the Bonk Kitchen as much as I enjoy making them. I think it's wonderful that you're able to be in charge of your own pace. And I would suggest watch these Zoomcasts as much as you possibly can. Once may not be enough. You only have to take one set of notes. And as I always like to say, as I wrap up one of my celebrations of learning, you know, the story may have ended today, but you know the saga is going to continue tomorrow. And the rest, as we say, everyone, is history. Peace out, everybody. Thank you so much. And as always, please be well.